And we'll go ahead and we'll get started today. So first of all, thank you everyone for being flexible with the date change for this. I really appreciate it. But you are here with us for polishing up on patron registration. So if you've attended virtual trainings before, you'll likely notice this one's a little longer than usual. Our virtual training sessions are typically an hour. We gave this one an hour and a half. And that's really because when you're working on registration, you're working with a lot of data. And these patron records are a basis of so much of what our database does and supports. Not only that, but there's also a number of variations of a registration that you do. And some of you may be thinking like, oh, patron registration, like no big deal, do it all the time. But you know what, it is a lot. And sometimes what gets lost in the routine is the context of why certain fields are filled out in a certain way, or how choosing a certain field option is going to impact what happens with the patron's record. So my hope for this training, my intent is that for newer staff or for staff who are less familiar with the Patron registration, you'll gain a knowledge of how to create and modify patron records. And for everyone who's attending, both newer staff and more seasoned veterans, I hope you're going to get a better understanding of what some of these fields do or why things are set up in a certain way. So for today, our focus, it's going to be on the LEAP patron registration work form. So how to fill it out, situations where you're going to need to pay attention to certain fields, and how certain fields are going to impact circulation. So in today's session, we're going to start by just taking a minute or two to define registration terms, and to go over some formatting guidelines. And then we're going to walk through the patron registration form field by field, and look at several other common registration situations, such as like renewing a record, re-registering a patron, or a non-CCS reciprocal borrower. And then finally, we're going to close with seeing where you can locate monthly registration statistics, and share just some information about updating and deleting patrons. Now, one thing I debated on with presenting this information is if it would be more helpful to like demonstrate right in LEAP or use slides. And I decided to go with the slides so that we could have both image and text together in the presentation. So that does mean that we have a pretty hefty amount of slides if you took a look at the presentation when it was emailed out yesterday. So we got a lot to go through. And with that, let's get started. So the first thing I want to do today is to review some related terminology that you're going to hear throughout this training. So to start with, pages in LEAP are called work forms. These can be either records like an item record or a patron record, or these can be a tool or form like the pick list or patron registration. So you will hear me refer to the patron registration page as the registration work form. Also, when we talk about registering a new patron, we are talking about registering a patron who does not yet have a record in our database. So in these situations, you are creating a record from scratch. Whereas with the renewal, renewals are when the patron has an existing record with you. And they've like reached their expiration date or you're extending their expiration date. So a real renewal takes place when the patron already has a card with you and you're extending the patron's library card privileges. Now, when we talk about re-registration in training, we're talking about a situation where the patron is registering at a new library, but they have an existing patron account in the CCS database. So with a re-registration, staff can use the patron's existing account and just update the fields to reflect the patron's status at their new home library. And then finally, during training today, when we mention a non-CCS reciprocal borrower, we're talking about patrons who belong to a library outside of CCS, like Chicago Public Library, Skokie, Arlington Heights, who will then register their card with us so they can borrow from CCS libraries. Now, the other thing I want to touch on in the introduction is formatting. There are several general formatting guidelines we follow when working with a patron record. So the first thing is that we use mixed case, meaning a mix of uppercase and lowercase for all names and addresses. We will refrain from using all caps. The next thing to watch out for with formatting is that there should be no spaces preceding beginning data in any field. So watch out for spaces at the beginning of the data fields. This is important because in some fields, like a barcode, spaces can cause errors when scanning a barcode or even like issuing a notice sometimes. Oops. And this is what you'll see. We'll see this a little later as well. And the third kind of general formatting guidelines is that we format addresses to follow USPS guidelines. And this is so we stay consistent when abbreviating things like row types and unit designations. You'll see some examples on the slide. You can find information about these guidelines and the USPS abbreviations on both the CCS website, patron registration how-to page, and in the CCS circulation manual. So that was a brief introduction. I want to move on to the bulk of the section, which is looking at the patron work form field by field. So what we're going to do here is walk through the blank fields of a patron registration work form as if we're creating a brand new patron record. So we get a chance to look at each data point in the record and essentially what this does or what it means for the patron. So before creating a new patron record, you want to search for the patron. You want to see if they have an existing record. If so, you will instead renew their account or re-register them, whatever is appropriate for the situation. And we want to use an existing record if they have it for a couple of reasons. First thing is that we just want to make sure the patron keeps things they have, like the lists they've created in the online catalog, or their reading history if they have that active, and there's no lapse in like their password or username if they have that set up. Re-registering using the existing account also makes sure that there's consistency to things like statistics and reporting. So like even if you create a new account but merge it into the old account, like that's still counted differently in the monthly circ stats. And then finally, re-registering also means that there's less steps for staff. Fields like name, email, notification option, those will be set up to the patron's preferences already. So if they have an existing record in the database, use that. Now, once you've searched for the patron and determined that they don't have an existing record in the database, you'll click the new patron button in LEAP, which will open up the blank registration work form. So like I said before, we're going to take our time here and walk through each field as you fill it out, starting with the profile section. So just disclaimer, my screenshots are of a fake account using a beloved children's book character. So there's no real patron information here. But the first up, so we're going to kind of walk through each field here. First up is the barcode. Barcode field contains the patron's current library card number. So to enter the barcode or to enter the number, just scan the barcode in the box or key in the digits. So this is a little troubleshooting tip for your patrons too. Just a moment ago during the formatting section, we talked about the space at the start of the data field. Barcode is the most common field where this can happen, especially if you're scanning a number in. So if you scan a patron's card after you've registered them, and you get a no matches found message, but you find you can search and locate the patron just fine by name, and it looks like that their barcode's entered properly. The most common culprit for this alert message is that there's a space at the start of the barcode number. So if you're having issues here, check the barcode field, remove that space. If after that, you should be fine to scan the card. With a former barcode, if we're registering a new patron, we won't be working with the previous barcode. This is going to come into play if renewing or re-registering a patron. We will discuss this field then. The name section, where it just says last name, first name, middle name. This is where you enter the patron's name, or if they have both a legal name and a preferred name, this is where the preferred name goes. So the name fields are separated out into first, middle, last. The first and last names are required field. The middle name is optional and can be filled out only if your library wants to collect middle names or initials. And it's the same with title and suffix. So title are things like Mr., Ms., Dr. Suffix fields are things like junior. These are also optional fields. So I mentioned preferred name versus legal name. If the patron has both a preferred and legal name, there are separate fields below where you can enter their legal name in. These are the name on identification fields. So like, for example, I have some friends who go by their middle names, but they have a different legal first name that appears on their driver's license. So this is where I would fill that information out. Now, you do not need to fill out this section if their preferred name is their legal name, which is, like, let's be honest, it's going to be most patrons. Staff can also choose to have the name on the ID be used with certain notice formats. And you'll note here, it just indicates print and phone notices by clicking on this checkbox. Now, by default, Polaris will use the preferred name with notices unless this checkbox is selected. So moving on to the right-hand column of the profile section, and this is kind of where we get into some of the more fun fields. The registered at fields. Now, when you open a new patron registration work form, the registered at field will default to your current location, right? The library you're working at. This field should reflect the patron's home library. So Highland Park Public Library card holders will have a registered at field of Highland Park. Round Lake Public Library card holders will have a registered at field of Round Lake. For non-CCS reciprocal borrowers, which we'll go into more detail later, the registered at field will be CCSB. This field is important and it's used for several things. So first, it's used when gathering statistics and reporting, like many of the fields in this section. Second, it's used for determining eligibility and prioritization for holds. So for example, if your library's new items can only be requested by your patrons at first, the database is going to check the registered at field to see if the patron should be allowed to place a hold. Third, it can be used by databases and e-content vendors to determine if the patron should be allowed to access that collection. So registered at branch, it's used for statistics and for collection eligibility. Next, we have the patron code. The patron code determines what circulation policies and limits to apply to the patron when they're checking out. For example, the maximum number of items and the total number of holds the patron can have at one time, those are both tied to the patron code. This code also plays a part in determining things like loan periods and if or how much to charge for overdue fees. So a lot of the circulation policies tied to the patron code. And you've probably seen when registering a patron or when in a registration work form, you have a set of library codes, dedicated library codes for your location. So every library has a set of 6 patron codes that they can label and apply based on their needs. And those needs are going to be driven by differences in circulation rules. So for example, like if I'm at Lake Villa, let's say my standard patron code, my LVK patron, has an overall checkout limit of 999 items. But we also issue library cards to educators who teach in the district. We allow those cards a checkout limit of 75. So we can designate one of our patron codes to be used just for teachers, right? We'll use this LVK educational, and we can set their limits differently. So this way, my patron, LVK patron, and my LVK educational can have different circulation limits. So again, when looking at a patron code, this code is determining what circulation policies and limits to apply to that patron. Just gonna pause and see if there are any questions coming through. So kind of moving a little further down with the expiration date. Now, when you create a patron record, expiration date is going to be autofilled based on your library standard expiration period, such as 3 years from today. If giving a different expiration date, you can either click on the field, use a calendar that to select the correct date, or you can key it in manually to this field. Birth date is also a required field. Now, the birth date is used both for verifying a patron's identity and for reporting. So we can use this field to determine, say, like how many minor versus adult card holders that you have. Also, we're in a consortium setting where we have almost like 500,000 patron records on file. We anticipate that number is just going to continue to grow if or when new libraries join CCS, right? So we can easily run into different patrons with the same name or very similar names. So birth date is just another way to help differentiate patrons of the same or similar name. Now, if you're registering a school or business that does not have a birth date, you will enter a placeholder date of January 1st, 1900. That's just a very obvious visual to everyone who's looking at the record that it is a false birth date. And now we get to the statistical class. The statistical class does not affect the patron's circulation limits or access to services in any way. It's only used for gathering statistics and generating reports. All CCS libraries share the same list of statistical classes. This is just to make comparative reporting, such as submitting stats for the Illinois IPLAR annually, easier. And as a result, because this list is shared between all libraries, not all of the stat classes may apply to your location. So for example, if you don't have like an intergovernmental agreement with local schools and you don't issue cards to their teachers, you may not have need for the teacher stat class, and that's okay. So we do have a list of these statistical classes along with brief definitions on our website under the How to Patron Registration section. And another thing to know about this list is that it may change if there are updates to Illinois library legislation, because chances are this is also going to change and result in changes to IPLAR reports. So like we've seen this recently in the past year or so with the Cards for Kids Act. And then finally in the profile section is gender. All I'm going to say about this gender field is that CCS can, and we are more than happy to suppress this field from view in the registration form. I know we've suppressed it for some libraries already. If you would like to also suppress this field from view, just open a help desk ticket. We can take care of that. So that is the profile section. And then we move on to the attributes section. Now, in terms of the attributes section, most of these fields, with the exception of the ILL RB library code and parent guardian, if the patron is under 18 are optional, or are just available if your library would like to use or needs to use these fields. So the parent guardian field, this should be pretty obvious. It's to record the parent or guardian name of patrons under the age of 18. This field is used pretty much just for staff reference. It does not impact circulation rules at all. It also cannot populate things like overdue notices or hold notices. It does not link records together. So again, it's pretty much just for staff reference. The language spoken at home field, this field is optional. Language spoken at home field, library staff can indicate the patron's primary language or the language they use in their everyday life. While this field displays for all based on your library's individual preference. So this field, like parent guardian, does not notice text. I'm sorry, I'm just getting a notice that my internet connection is unstable. Can everyone still hear me? And it dipped out a bit. I'm glad you. Hey, I'm so sorry about that. Can everyone hear me again? Okay, I really hope that is a very temporary glitch. Looks like we are recording again. So let me share my screen and we will pick back up. Okay, thank you so much for putting up with that, that glitch there. Let's see. So we're going to pick back up right here. A library does not need to use language spoken at home, but what they can potentially use this for, they can use statistics from this field to help inform material selection for non-English materials. So if your library collects this data, you can get a sense of how many of your users speak Spanish, Polish, Korean, and figure out how much of each language you want to collect then. Moving down, the internet access field is another optional field that may or may not be used by your library. If your library requires patrons to log in with their library card to your public use computers, or if you restrict internet access, like based on like age, you will likely use this field. Now, if your library uses this field, you will pick the appropriate entry based on how your access program authenticates patrons. Um, Now, additionally, some libraries now authenticate users for extended building access using this field. Like, for example, you may encounter a Palatine patron with Open Plus PAK in this field. And this just allows approved patrons to be able to enter the North Hoffman or Rand Road branch locations before or after staffed hours. With the driver's license, again, this is an optional field. If your library utilizes this field, you can scan or key in a patron's driver's license number here. This field is indexed, meaning then you're able to scan their driver's license or search by their license number to pull up their record. At the top of the next column is the race ethnicity. This is a relatively new attribute in the patron's record. This is very much optional for libraries. This field came to be because a library asked to begin gathering race and ethnicity data for their cardholders to ensure that they're equitably serving all patrons in their community. If your library is not collecting race and ethnicity data, just about all of our libraries do not, this field will by default only have none and not applicable as options. So field options will only be visible to patrons who are registered to a library that has this field active. So ILRB library code, this is another stats only field. This is only used for reciprocal borrowing statistics. And this field should reflect the user's home library, even if the user is a non-CCS reciprocal borrower. This field is going to default to your library, so you shouldn't need to modify it when registering a new local patron. And then finally, we've got the care of. So while the parent guardian field is used specifically for minor children, the care of field is meant to be used to record the point of contact for a school or a business card, or the caretaker of an adult patron. So again, just like our other fields, this is just used for staff reference. It's not used for notices. It does not link records together. Now, in addition to these standard fields that everyone sees, your library may see like an additional field here. For example, some libraries may have an equipment or makerspace accreditation field to show that patrons have gone through equipment training. Most libraries will see this set of attributes. Below that, we've got the email address. So if the patron provides an email address entered into the email field, patrons with an email address will receive reminder notices. And these are things like the auto renewal or due date reminder notices. So patrons with an email address will receive reminder notices no matter what their notice preference is. This field is also used if the patron wants to get emailed receipts. In terms of the alt email address, the alt email address is just used for e-receipts. So if the alt email address field is populated, Polaris will issue an e-receipt to both the primary email address and the alt email address. So one thing to note, notices are not delivered to the alt email address, just used for e-receipts. And there's my little alert. Okay. Now I get into the section of the registration work form that contains the address information. So first of all, the address type. This describes what kind of address this is, be it a home address, a work address, or others. So it's just kind of like, it's an address label, basically. The overwhelming majority of patrons will have their home address on file with the library. For patrons who have gone through the National Change of Address Verification Project and have moved, staff will see a previous home or prev home for their in their address fields. The address type, it really doesn't impact what Polaris does with the actual address. It's more to like sort print notices, and we'll see where this comes into play in our next section. Now, when inputting an address, start with the postal code. If Polaris is able, it will automatically input the city and state information for you based on the postal code. Now, as you see here, if the postal code covers multiple cities or counties, or even if there's spelling variations of a city or county, it will prompt you to select the correct option from a list. Now, I know it's annoying to see like all the different options, but for some cities or counties, the multiple options is an evil necessity. So, for example, if you've ever worked with patrons who live in like DuPage County, I do for the USPS, both DuPage with a space and DuPage without a space are accepted. So a lot of times you will see all the USPS variations in there. Now, once you've got the postcode, the city stamp filled out, you can enter in the street address. So use street 1. If necessary, you can use street address line 2 or 3. So again, CCS does use those standardized abbreviations for things like unit designations, road types, and cardinal directions. And again, like we said earlier, those standardizations can be located in the how-to section on the website and in the CCS circulation manual. Now the patron, you have access to up to 3 different street address lines. The guidelines are to use the lines based on your local preference. So for example, your library may prefer to keep unit information in line 1, or you may prefer to move it to line 2. Now, the nice thing about searching in LEAP is that all of the address fields are indexed together as a phrase. So, even if I put unit information in line 2, I can still search for a patron using their street address and unit information together without having to select this data in line 1, this data in line 2. And then, most patrons are just going to have that one address on file with the library. But if appropriate, you do have the ability to add multiple addresses. So if a patron has a summer home and a winter home, or say, you are working with a student, they have a dorm address and a home address. And again, you may see patrons who have multiple addresses due to the National Change of Address Verification Project. So most patrons are just going to have one address. We do have the option of adding additional addresses here. Let me just pause. So question, alternative spellings for towns and cities are just because they're approved spellings for USPS? Correct. It doesn't impact anything on the library's end if staff alternate choosing between which one. Correct. If some of your patrons are under Old Mill Creek spelled out and some of your patrons are under Old Mill Creek CRK, that's not going to impact anything with the patrons. Finally, in the address section, we've got the address check date. So just like the expiration date, this field is auto-filled based on your local settings. However, you can edit this field manually if you need. Address check date can be used as an indication to re-verify the patron's residency. just like the patron's expiration date, once the address check date passes, a hard block is added to the patron's account, which will block them from checking out. So below that, we have our phone and fax fields. We can add up to 3 phone numbers and a fax number for each patron. Now, in order to be read by our automated telephony system, phone numbers should be used by entering hyphens or using those parentheses like in this slide. One thing you shouldn't do, don't enter the country code. So for US numbers, this is the one before the area code. Telephony will automatically add the country code in for us. So a extra one can prompt the call to error out. Oh, question back for addresses, typing the cardinal directions, west, north, south, with or without a period at the end. That doesn't matter. So in Polaris, when you're searching, it basically treats the punctuations like a period as a space. So it's going to search W period or W without the period as the same. It's a good question. Another thing to watch out for with our phone is that it cannot support extensions. So again, the telephony system won't be able to read an extension. Patron won't be able to receive phone calls. Second, there's a character limit for the phone field, so you likely won't be able to enter in the full number with an extension anyways. Okay, and then before I talked about things like the address type impacting notices, so let's talk a little bit about these notice settings too. And then first we've got the notice address. This field is used with print notices, and it controls where the patron's print notices are sent to. So this field is a drop-down menu, and the options are going to reflect that address type. So like we said before, most patrons have one address on file with the library. Most of the time that address is going to have a label of home. By default, that's what's going to be assigned here. However, if the patron has, like say, a home address and a work address on file with the library, you can specify which addresses their notice should be mailed to here. So like I said, you'll probably most of the time you're going to see this is if you have like a lot of college students in your service area. You might be choosing between like the school address and the home address, or their dorm address, I mean. And then we also have our e-receipt option. Would the patron prefer to receive an email receipt in place of or in addition to their printed receipt? If so, you can activate that option here by selecting email address. Now, depending on the Workstation Leap printer settings, the patron can either be set up to get both an email receipt and a print receipt, or they can be set up to only receive an e-receipt. I suspect your workstations are already set up for your print options as you desire, but you will see these options under settings, print options, and anywhere where it says like checkout receipt, and then there's also the option only if no receipt. So, I'm not going to go over this now. Like I said, I suspect everything's set up as you want it to be. If you are interested in seeing these print receipts in action, you can stick around after training, ask me to pull it up. I will show you. Next, we've got our good old notification option. This is where you or patrons can specify which notice format you would primarily like to get. And I say primarily because if you've ever attended a notices focused training before, you know that there's some exceptions. So like, for example, bills aren't issued as a phone notice. phone notice patrons will still receive print bill notices. And then, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, reminder notices, those almost overdues or auto renewals. I'm sorry, someone rang my doorbell. My dog is going crazy right now, so I apologize to anyone who can hear him. So even if a patron has like a phone notice option or print notice option here, if they have an email address on file with the library, they will receive those reminder notices. Now, it's important to always designate a notification option for a patron. If you leave their option set to none, that will stop the patron from getting notices. And if overdue and bill notices aren't being generated for them, their items will never age to lost. So it's always important to select a notification option for the patron. The additional text notice. Patrons can choose to receive an additional text message for most notices on top of their email notice by selecting this additional text checkbox. Now, if the patron wants an email notice and that additional text notice, you can set their preferences up like in the screenshot here. However, if the patron's primary notice preference is text, avoid selecting the additional checkbox. We've found that for some patrons, setting them up for text notices plus adding the additional text notice can cause issues when delivering the notices. So just avoid having both the option of text messaging and the additional text checkbox. Now, if the patron wants to receive any kind of text notice, we do need to specify which phone number to send the text notices to. So in the text message phone field, you will instruct Polaris which phone number to use when issuing texts. And then additionally, if the patron wants to receive any kind of text notice, we also need to know their carrier or their network. And again, if you've been here before to trainings recently, this is because our text notices start out emails, and then they kind of go through a process to translate them into a text message using what's called a gateway. Each carrier network has their own gateway. This means we need to know what network the user is on in order to make that translation. So this is one of my new favorite tricks. If the patron is on consumer cellular, which piggybacks off of other networks, or if maybe they're not quite sure what carrier network they have, there is a little trick that the library can do to help the patron figure out what network they're on, right? So if you're at the Notices Bootcamp in July, you already know this trick, but have the user text your email. Just like the email to text process, their text message will basically go through the reverse. So it's gonna start out as a text message, go through that gateway and be translated into an email. So using that email, like the from, the domain, and the message branding, we can see what network they're on. So for me, if I send a text to my office email, from that resulting email address and branding, someone else can tell that I am on T-Mobile's network. So if you're interested in more information on the different notice formats or just notices in general, I encourage you to check out the notices section under the how-to page on the CCS website. Okay, we're getting close to the end of the patron registration work. Like I said earlier, there's a lot of data here. So I want to get to the checkboxes that you see under preferences. Now, this first set of checkboxes allows you to exclude a patron from generating certain types of notices. So, okay, listen, if a patron comes to you and says, I don't need those due date reminder notices, that's cool. You can stop those from generating for this patron by selecting this box here, almost overdue auto renewal. Their items will still auto renew, they just won't get that reminder notice. What we want to avoid here is excluding the patron from overdue notices or bill notices. So again, if these notices aren't being generated, the items will never age to lost. So it's important that overdues and bills are being generated for all patrons. The next section, the language. So I've got another language section here, but the language drop down in the preferences section determines what language notices are sent in. English is the default, but if a patron wishes to receive notices in a different language like Spanish or Polish, you can specify that here. The patron can also update this preference in the online catalog account. Now, one thing I find frustrating about this particular field in LEAP is that it displays all possible supported languages, not just the ones that we have access to. So there are a few languages in here that aren't included in our license, but they're hard-coded into the list. So here's a summary of what languages that we can offer. And I will re-email out the slides after training is done. So if you want to make notes on this or print it out, you absolutely can. The remaining checkboxes here, it's just a smattering of random settings. Staff do have access to a checkbox setting that will turn on a patron's reading history. Now, we don't want to touch this unless we have explicit permission from the patron, right? We don't want to retain their checkout history without them knowing. That's very important. The patron also has access to this setting in their online catalog account. They can absolutely turn on reading history themselves. And then one quick thing to mention about reading history, it will only start recording from point of activation forward. So if a patron has had their account for years and they just now ask you to turn that setting on, their previous checkouts are not going to be recorded. Just checkouts from this point forward. Conversely, if you deselect the reading history checkbox, it's going to erase all history that's been stored. And then basically the patron's starting from scratch again once it's selected, once it's turned back on. The do not delete checkbox, it's just as it sounds. It will block a patron's record from being deleted. Later on in the training, we'll look at the regular database maintenance that happens for patron records and what qualifies a patron for being deleted. Okay, our email notices, got email notices in plain text. Now, our email notices by default are sent out in HTML format. And just this year, we've revamped the HTML to be more user-friendly. So there's bigger text, better formatting. The email notices in plain text format will prompt notices to be sent in plain text and not in HTML. Now, at this time, we don't want to send notices in plain text format. So I don't know if you remember seeing a listserv email from earlier this spring about how plain text overdue email notices are not being generated. That particular bug is still going on. It's still an issue. So we want to avoid using this checkbox for now. CCS has been scanning for plain text patrons weekly and updating the checkbox. So if you do happen to have a patron with this selected, they'll be fixed. We've got them covered. And then finally, there's the exclude from collection agency checkbox. Now this checkbox is only relevant for libraries who submit patrons to collections. If you do submit to a collection agency and you want to make sure this user is not sent, like for example, they're a home services patron, you can use this checkbox. If you don't submit to collections, you don't have to pay attention to that field. Okay, so we've made it to the end of the patron registration work form. We're at the password section. Now, how you manage this field can depend on local practice. Let me tell you what happens with it overnight. So if a password field is empty, the patron will have until the end of the day to create their own password in the online catalog. If this password field is left blank and the patron does not go online and create their own password by the end of the day, an overnight process will assign the last 4 digits of the phone 1 field as their password. So starting the next day, they will have last 4 digits of phone 1. Now, when you've finished filling out the registration fields, you can click Save to finish creating a new patron record. And there are several things LEAP will review at this time. The first thing is LEAP will notify you if there are any required fields that have not yet been filled out, or if there are errors in the fields. And the nice thing is LEAP is going to tell you exactly what needs to be filled out, so you don't have to go through and take a guess. More commonly, you may also see a pop-up that says valid email address not found. And let me clear up why you see this. This alert appears for any patron that does not have an email address on file. And it pops for anyone with a blank email field because those reminder notices, right? Those due date coming soon, auto renewal notices, those are only issued as emails. And as we said earlier, they're issued to any patron with an email address in the record, regardless of notice preference. So this pop-up is a reminder for staff that the patron won't receive the reminder notices because they do not have an email on file in the record. So you will always be able to click continue to bypass this alert. Unfortunately, this is another option that's like hard-coded into LEAP. We can't deactivate it. And then finally, LEAP will display records that may be duplicates. Review duplicate patron warnings. If the duplicates are not valid, you can click continue to complete saving the record. Now, I don't know how many people are aware of this. Once you've saved the record, you'll see additional options pop up. And one of those options is a copy button. Now, if you're registering a family, the copy button could potentially help you save some time. So what this button does, it opens up a new patron registration work form, but it pre-populates with just about all of the same information as the original record, which does include fields like name and birth date. Just here's a quick clip of what a copied registration work form looks like. So as you can see, I've got the name in there, the birth date, but it also adds in things like all of the attributes and the address and the contact information. So again, if you use this, you'll definitely still need to check and modify fields. But if you're in a situation like where you're creating cards for very small kids and the parent is using their own contact information for the kids, like you'll already have things like the address, the phone number, email address, notification preferences set up in the record. So depending on your situation, this field may or may not save you some time. Yes, very useful for signing up large families with kids. Okay, that is our walkthrough of the patron registration work form. Some of the fields can be set up to be pre-populated, the fields in the slide, which can help save time for your typical resident patron. Also means you are going to need to pay attention when registering non-typical users. Setting up defaults for any of these fields will help streamline things for you, and these are not already set up. Again, open a help desk ticket, email help@ccslib.org, and we can get that set up for you. Now, during the next segment of training, I just want to quickly look at some other registration scenarios you will encounter. So for these, I'm not going to walk through setting up the whole registration work form step by step. Instead, we're just going to highlight the fields you'll want to pay attention to when working with a patron. And the other scenarios we're going to look at today includes renewing a patron record, re-registering a patron, and registering a non-CCS reciprocal borrower. So first, let's talk about what we're going to look at with renewing a patron. And to recap the definition, renewals are when the patron has an existing record with you and you are extending their library's privileges. So when you renew, you'll use their existing record, verify that their information is correct and up to date, and then update their expiration and or address check date. Now there's two ways to update these, the expiration and the address check date. The first option is the renew button. You'll find this on the right-hand side of the registration work form. And this button will allow you to update both the expiration date and the address check date at once. These dates are going to default to your library's registration period, but you can specify a different number of years here if you need. The second option is to update both dates manually. Clicking in the expiration date or address check date fields will open a calendar, and then you can pick a specific date. Now, if you renew manually, it's important to remember to update both the expiration date and the address check date. If you forget the address check date, which is easy to do, the patron can still be hard blocked. Now, when you're renewing the registration, right, you're probably going to be reviewing their information to make sure everything's up to date. There's two specific fields I want to highlight here to consider when you renew. We've come back to the former barcode. So if the patron is getting a new card number, you do want to copy and paste their old number into the former barcode field before scanning that new card in. And why is that? Mostly for e-content services. So patrons who use ebook services like Overdrive, they may need to have their former barcode retained in order to transfer ebook account information from the old card number to the new card number. And whatever department in your library is responsible for this can reference the old card number in the former barcode field. However, former barcode field does not have an active application, meaning if a patron tries to scan their old card number at a self-check machine, or if they're trying to log into like a database or the online catalog, the service isn't going to be able to identify the patron using the former barcode field. So in terms of circulation, there's no real application for the former barcode field. And then finally, if the patron was previously a minor, but now they are age 18 or older, check parent guardian field to see if there's data to delete. The next situation I wanted to highlight fields to pay attention to is for re-registration. So to review, when we're talking about re-registration here, we're talking about when a patron is registering at a new library, but they have an existing patron account in the CCS database. So these will be situations where, say, patron used to live in Palatine, but they've moved to Morton Grove. So when you're re-registering a patron, you'll use their existing record and you'll update the data to reflect their new home library, right? So when the patron comes to you for a new card, you'll do that usual search and you'll see their existing account, pull it up and you can modify it. So, you'll do the usual, go through the fields, update address, check that their contact information is up to date. And now there's several other data fields that you're going to want to pay attention to here. First, just like when renewing a patron, copy and paste that old number into the former barcode field before scanning the new card number in. Also, in the first section of the registration work form in profiles, you'll need to change the registered at field from their old library to your library, to their new home library. Now, this ensures that the patron is recognized as your patron in statistics and reporting, that they're recognized as your patron when determining eligibility and prioritization for holds, and again, for some vendors, that they are eligible to access your e-content and databases. Let's see. Then you'll also, once you change the registered at field, that patron code list should scope to your library. And then you can choose the appropriate patron code from that list. And again, patron code determines what circulation policies and limits to apply to the patron when they're checking out. Additionally, you'll also want to check the statistical class as well. Now this one may or may not change. For example, the patron may have been an in-district resident at their old library, and they're still an in-district resident at the new library, which case this field won't change. Or you may have a patron who had a non-resident fee card at their old library, but now they're an in-district resident, in which case you will need to update the field. So this field may or may not change, but definitely still double check it. And as we've said before, while the statistical class will not impact circulation, it's very important for reporting, especially with IPLAR. And then finally, in terms of the attributes section, you will need to update the ILL-RB code field so that it reflects the new home library. And again, this is for statistics and for reporting. So those are just some highlighted fields to pay attention to when re-registering a patron. Your library may have additional fields that are relevant to you, like if your library uses that internet access attribute, or if they are collecting the language spoken at home attribute. I'm just going to pause and check chat here for a second. Now, the last registration scenario that I just want to review is registering a new non-CCS reciprocal borrower. So these are patrons who have valid accounts at a library outside of CCS, and they want to register so they can use their card at a CCS library. So with non-CCS reciprocal borrowers, you will absolutely still want to search LEAP for existing accounts. And then you also have that extra step of just verifying that their card is in good standing with their home library. But here are the big differences when registering a non-CCS reciprocal borrower over a local patron. First of all, we once again have that registered at field. So register non-CCS reciprocal borrowers to CCSB, which is basically the CCS branch. And then, as I said before, this field can affect which e-content resources a patron has access to. It affects statistics, eligibility, and preference for local materials for holds. So it should be set to CCSB in order to differentiate those non-CCS patrons from your local patrons. Likewise, you will assign a patron code of either CPL patron if their home library is Chicago Public Library, or reciprocal patron if their home library is any other library outside of CCS. As we've said before, patron code dictates circulation-related policies, like how many items the patron can have checked out, how many holds they can place at one time. And one of the major reasons why we differentiate Chicago patrons from all other reciprocal patrons is that a library may or may not have a reciprocal borrowing agreement with CPL. So if a library does not have a reciprocal agreement with Chicago, this allows the library to limit or restrict circulation to CPL users. Now for expiration dates and the address check date, our governing board policy says that non-CCS patron registrations must include the expiration date provided by the patron's home library or a maximum of 3 years from the date of registration. So basically, you're going to give the patron whatever date comes first. So let's say the patron is registering with you today. Their home library card expires in May 2024. You'll enter that date. If their home library has non-expiring cards, you will input a date of 3 years then. And I've put the page that you can find this policy in the CCS governing board policy. Now, similarly to the patron code, the patron statistical class should be set to either reciprocal patron or to Chicago Public Library patron. Again, this doesn't impact circulation, but it is used for statistics. And then finally, you will set the ILL-RB library code to reflect their home library. Many home public libraries in the northern half of Illinois, and even some in the southern part of the state, are already part of this list. So hopefully all of the area libraries where you have reciprocal borrowers that you need should be in there. If you do have a patron from a library that's on the list, feel free to submit a ticket to CCS. We can add that in. Okay. So those were like the other major registration scenarios that you'll encounter with patrons. And like I said, I just wanted to highlight some important fields to pay attention to when working on those kind of accounts. So I'm going to pause for a second for questions before we get to the reports and monthly maintenance section. Okay. So the next thing I want to touch on is how registrations and renewals are counted in a particular web report, and just to review some aspects of patron record maintenance. So with the web report we're going to be looking at today is the monthly Circuit Department stats report. Now we've talked about different registration scenarios, right? Creating new patrons, renewing patrons, re-registering patrons. These statistics are all reflected in this web report. So this report runs the first of every month, and it captures data from the previous month, including this card data. So here's something interesting about the report. While some card transactions are really easy to determine, right? For example, a new record is created. Other types of transactions are not. So things like editing specific fields, like an expiration date, is not recorded as a transaction within itself. So we don't have anything to count for gathering statistics on renewals, essentially. But how this report determines these different kinds of statistics is that it looks at a snapshot of patron data from the start of the month and compares it to a snapshot of data from the previous month. And it looks at what's changed in the patron's record. And this is how it counts things like renewal scenarios and re-registration scenarios. I tried to tell, Trisha, can you expand on that a little bit? For which field? Or is this
like the registration card? So what happened is we have some short keystrokes.
Oh, okay.
And so sometimes instead of them taking the card and scanning it under the scanner,
Mhm.
they put in the short keystroke and add the whatever, the last 6 digits
Oh,
or the last 7 digits.
I get you.
And then if they use the wrong short keystroke, it might add one additional number, and then we're off by it.
Yeah. And then when you scan the barcode to check out,
It
it
won't
won't bring
it
it up.
won't register, right?
Yeah. That's a good tip for any library who has those shortcuts. So for this report here, we're gonna just take a very quick look at this report. How you read this report, basically, you will use the descriptions in the transaction type column to identify the statistics that relate to patron registration. And then we're going to get our count from column C, which is the number of patrons or items or transactions. So the first numbers related to registration that you are going to encounter in this report are for renewals, which is potentially broken down into 2 numbers depending on how your library does this. So we're looking at, in the report, this should be lines 46 and 47. First is patron expiration date extended more than 30 days. So these are straight renewals, basically. If the user's expiration date has been extended 30 days or more from that snapshot from the previous month is counted here. So if the expiration date has been extended more than 30 days, it's counted as a renewal. And this way it doesn't count like a courtesy extension of, a week. So these are users whose expiration dates were extended, but their barcode did not change. Now, the report also gives a count of existing users who have been given a new barcode. If your library treats a card replacement like a renewal and you extend the expiration date is the same time you issue a new card, you can also then count this as number as a renewal. And if that's the case, you will count up both numbers here to get a renewal count for the last month. Now, if your library does not extend dates when issuing a replacement card, all this number is going to show you is how many card replacements you've done in the past month. A little further down in this report is a section where the report gives numbers on patron record activity during the previous month. And this is where we can get information on new patron records and re-registrations. So the line with the transaction description plus patron records physically added, which is line 52 in our screenshot. This is the count of new registrations for your library. So these are brand new patron records created. They did not exist the previous month. Right below that, line 53 in the screenshot, is a line titled plus patron library changed from some CCS library to your library. So this is the count of users who moved into your district and re-registered your card. So basically this line looks at card users registered to your library and looks at that snapshot before to see if they had a different registered at branch. So again, these are re-registrations your library has done. These 2 lines together will give you the total of new patrons added to your library. And finally, below that section, This is where you can get a number of new non-CCS reciprocal borrowers your library registered in the past month. So you'll look for the entry for LEAP registrations, where the subtype is patron library equals CCSL. So these are users registered to that cooperative computer services branch. So from this report, I can add up the numbers in a way that's relevant to my library. Again, based on how my library maybe like extends or issues new cards or issues new card numbers, how you do your renewals. So your library may absolutely have a local system for recording stats as well. But I just wanted to kind of go over this report, just kind of show you what was available on web reports if you need. And the final thing that I wanted to review is briefly look at some record maintenance. Now, the first aspect of this is maintaining record data in between renewals. Like, for example, a patron may come to you and ask you to update their contact information. Now, staff may make any updates needed to local patron accounts, right? So these are patrons registered to your own library, and non-CCS reciprocal borrowers. But if the user is registered to a different CCS library than your own, we do have some data guidelines to follow here. So if a user from a different CCS library asks you to modify their information, you can absolutely update things like contact information, right? So you can put in a new phone number, update their email. You can change their notification option, right? So this is if they want to switch from like phone notices to email notices. You can update their language or language spoken at home fields. And of course, you can update their password. Changes to any other fields like their address must be done by the patron's home library. We also perform regular monthly maintenance where we purge eligible patron records. Our purge follows criteria set by governing board. Again, you can find this on page 40 of their policies. So this is what makes a patron eligible for deletion. And the patron has to meet all criteria here. So first of all, the patron has to be inactive for at least 3 years. And they've accumulated less than $15 in fines from any library. And they have not been sent to a collection agency. And they do not have any items checked out. So once a month, CCS sweeps for patrons that meet all of this criteria, and we delete those patron records as cleanup. Now, in addition to this monthly cleanup, libraries may also delete their patrons individually as needed, or if you want to do a local database cleanup project. Your deletion criteria may differ from the monthly purge criteria. So for examples, like you may opt to delete patrons who owe more than $15 to your library, or you can delete a patron that's only been inactive for 1 year. However, just some guidelines to follow here. Libraries should not delete a patron if they owe money or lost item bills to a different library. Now that most of our libraries are fine-free, existing fees are going to be things like fees that have been manually added or those lost item bills. If the patron has items checked out from a different library. So those two should be like fairly obvious ones, but just some important guidelines to keep in mind before you delete a patron. Now, if you do find that you need to delete an individual patron, you will open the patron's record, click into that registration work form, and you will click delete. Now there's a small safeguard in place. If you realize you didn't mean to delete the patron, thankfully a pop-up will appear asking you to confirm. Now it's very important to realize that once the patron record is deleted, it cannot be undeleted. we don't have that same undelete option that we do with other record types like items or bibs or record sets. Once a patron is deleted, we can't bring it back. Now, we may be able to rebuild the information in the patron registration fields if that patron can be located in our training database. But once it's deleted, we still lose things like the patron history and statistics. So it goes without saying, but be very careful when manually deleting. Okay, we made it to our wrap up. We have covered a lot today. So here's just a quick recap of everything that we've touched on. Now, if you're looking for information about patron registration, the best place to go is to the CCS website. We've got the public services page of our how-to section. There is a dedicated category called patron registration. And here you'll find step-by-step instructions and short videos all about patron registration in LEAP. There's also a structured online course about patron registration. You can jump around there if you want. And then, of course, the circulation manual has information about creating, updating patrons. And then once again, you can find the policies we referenced today in the CCS Governing Board policy document. If you ever have questions about registration, please do not hesitate to reach out to me or CCS. Open a help desk ticket, email help@ccslib.org. Feel free to reach out to me directly. I will email out the recording through L2 site when it's available. You should also see it linked to in an upcoming issue of CCS News. So you should be getting an email from me later today with that information. So at this point, I'm going to stop the recording and I'll stick around for any questions that you may have.